Lover's Leap. The Legend of Mizzy and Tunkey. A Jamaican Folklore. The Cliff at St. Elizabeth. Caribbean Wind. The deep sound of the sea far below. A single bird call. Then stillness. There is a place in St. Elizabeth on the southern coast of Jamaica where the land ends without apology. The cliff rises 1,700 feet above the Caribbean Sea, a sheer wall of earth and stone that has stood since before the island had a name anyone wrote down. From its edge on a clear morning, the sea goes on forever. The horizon is not a line from up there. It is a feeling. It is the world telling you, quietly and without cruelty, that it is larger than anything you have ever feared or wanted. The local people call it Lover's Leap. They have called it that for more than 2 centuries now, and the name has outlasted the plantation that once scarred the land nearby, outlasted the men who believed they could own other men, outlasted every careful attempt to reduce this island's pain to something manageable and polite. The name belongs to 2 people. Their names were Mizzy and Tunkey. And what happened between them, and what happened because of them, is the kind of story that a place holds in its bones long after the people who lived it are gone. This is that story. Listen. The island and its wounds. Ocean waves. The sound of cane fields and wind. Distant work songs, low, steady, human. To understand what Mizzy and Tunkey found in each other, you must first understand the world that tried to make love impossible. The late 18th century in Jamaica was a world divided down the middle by violence and by silence about that violence. Sugar was king. The great estates stretched across the parishes, vast, relentless operations that consumed the land and consumed the people who were forced to work it. The Yardley Chase estate in St. Elizabeth was one of these places. Its cane fields were well kept. Its great house sat on a rise, looking out at the sea. From a distance, it might have looked almost peaceful. Distances lie. They have always lied. Up close, Yardley Chase was what all such estates were, a system of total control. Every hour of every day was spoken for. Every movement, every relationship, every small act of humanity had to be either stolen or suppressed. The people who labored there were not permitted, in the eyes of the law, to be people at all. And yet they were. They loved their children. They remembered their mother's songs. They marked the seasons in their own way, held their own ceremonies, carried their own names alongside the ones the plantation imposed. They found joy in the narrow spaces left to them, the way water finds its way through stone, not because stone is kind, but because water is determined. This is the world Mizzy was born into. This is the world that tried, with every tool at its disposal, to prevent what was coming. It did not succeed. Mizzy. Morning birds. The soft sound of a house waking. Whined through open shutters. Her name was Mizzy. She worked as a housekeeper at the Yardley Chase estate, one of the enslaved people assigned to the great house rather than the fields, which was its own particular kind of captivity. The house was cooler than the cane. The work was quieter. But the walls of the great house were no less a prison for being well furnished, and Mizzy understood this with the clear-eyed intelligence she carried like a second skin. She was known for her quietness. Not the quietness of someone who has given up, but the quietness of someone who is always listening, always measuring, always holding more inside than she allows the world to see. She had dark eyes that took in a room completely before she had crossed the threshold. She had hands that were quick and sure, and that she kept busy, always, because busy hands drew less attention than still ones. She had her mother's laugh, low and private, kept for moments when she was certain it was safe. She had her grandmother's memory for stories, the old ones from across the water, stories that the plantation could not reach because they lived inside her, not on any piece of land the estate could claim. She did not trust easily. She had learned early what trust cost in a world that treated her as property. She gave it slowly, carefully, and only when she was certain. She gave it, eventually, only once. Completely. Without reservation. She gave it to Tunkey. Tunkey. The sound of physical labor. Wood. Rope. Effort. A man working with great purpose. His name was Tunkey. He lived and labored on a neighboring estate, close enough that on a still evening you could hear the work songs carry across the ridge, close enough that the two estates shared a boundary line marked by a row of old silk cotton trees whose roots had long since grown together underground, indifferent to the property disputes of the men above. Tunkey was tall, strong in the way that men are strong who have been required to be strong long before they were ready. He had a stillness about him that was different from Mizzy's. Hers was watchful, calculating. His was something deeper. A steadiness. The kind that does not come from certainty about what the world will bring, but from certainty about who you are inside of it, whatever it brings. He was known among the people of both estates as someone you could rely on. Not in the way the plantation valued reliability, as obedience, as compliance, but in the truer sense. If he said a thing, he meant it. If he made a promise, he kept it. In a world designed to strip people of every form of dignity, Tunkey had found a way to keep his. It cost him, but he kept it. He had seen Mizzy across the boundary line more than once before they ever spoke. He had noticed the way she carried herself, unhurried, precise, with a kind of internal authority that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with character. He had not known what to do with that noticing for a very long time. Eventually, he had done the only thing worth doing. He had found a reason to cross the silk cotton line. Stolen moments. Dusk settling. Insects beginning. The distant sound of the sea. Two people breathing. Love between enslaved people was not forbidden outright. It was something more insidious than that. It was made precarious. Deliberately, strategically precarious. Because a person who loves someone has something to lose. And a person who has something to lose is easier to control. Mizzy and Tunkey understood this. They understood it the way you understand weather on an island, not as an abstraction, but as something that shapes every decision you make about where to stand and when to move and when to be still. So they were careful. They met in the brief, unreliable spaces between the demands of two estates at the boundary of the silk cotton trees in the low evening light, when the workday was done and the overseers had turned their attention elsewhere. They spoke quietly. They learned each other slowly, the way you learn a landscape, not from a single vantage point, but from walking through it again and again, from every angle, in every kind of light. Tunkey told her about his home before, the fragments his mother had carried across the water and pressed into him like seeds. The names of things in a language he was not permitted to speak aloud. The shape of a coast he had never seen but could describe from memory as though he had stood there himself. Mizzy listened. She stored what he gave her alongside her own fragments, her own grandmother's stories, the other half of a map that neither of them had complete, but that together it became something you could almost navigate by. She told him things she had never told anyone. Not from carelessness, from choice. Deliberate, eyes-open choice. She decided he was worth the risk of being known. She was not wrong. What they built together in those stolen evenings was not grand in the way the world measures grandeur. It had no great house, no deed, no record in any ledger. But it was real. It was, in the truest sense, there's the one thing in their lives that the estate could not inventory or assign or take. Until Richard Chadley noticed. The master of Yardley Chase. The great house. A clock. Footsteps on polished floors. The sound of a man who believes the world belongs to him. Richard Chadley had inherited Yardley Chase from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him, and the estate had shaped him the way such places shape the men who grow up at their center, with a deep, unexamined certainty that the world existed to serve his preferences. He was not, by the standards of his time and class, considered a cruel man. He did not seek out suffering for its own sake. He considered himself, in fact, a reasonable man, a practical man, a man of order. But there is a particular kind of violence that lives inside the word reasonable when it is spoken by men who have constructed an entire world around the suppression of other human beings. It is a violence that does not always announce itself with a raised voice or a raised hand. Sometimes it announces itself quietly, with the soft certainty of a man who has never once in his life been told that something he wanted was not his to take. Yardley had watched Mizzy for some time before his watching became something that infected his thinking. He told himself it was an employer's interest in a capable worker. He told himself many things. Men like Yardley were practiced in the art of telling themselves the right things. When he discovered, from a word dropped carelessly, from a pair of eyes that glanced toward the silk cotton trees at dusk, that Mizzy's attention, her loyalty, her heart, belonged to a man on a neighboring estate, the reasonableness left him entirely. What replaced it was something older and uglier. Not love. Yardley did not love Mizzy. He did not know her. He had never asked. What replaced his reasonableness was possession. The rage of a man who believes ownership extends to everything within his sight, and who has found, to his profound offense, something that disagrees. The order. A quill on paper. A door closing. The sound of something being decided in a room from which there is no appeal. The arrangements were made quickly. That was the nature of such power. It could rearrange lives with the speed and casualness of moving furniture. Richard Yardley sent word to the neighboring estate. He arranged for Tunkey to be sold. Not to anyone nearby, to a plantation on a distant part of the island, far enough to make reunion impossible, far enough to make love a memory that would fade, eventually, into something manageable. He believed this would be the end of it. He did not know Mizzy. He did not know that she had been watching him the way she watched everything completely, from the moment she entered a room, storing every piece of information she gathered against the day it might become necessary. She learned of the sale before Tunkey did. She learned it from a word overheard, from the particular way a door was closed at a particular hour, from the small seismic tremors that move through a plantation when something significant has been decided at the top. She had spent her life learning to read those tremors. She had always known, somewhere beneath hope, that this day might come. She did not weep. Not then. She thought. And then she moved. The plan. Night. Crickets. The island breathing in the dark. Two voices, quiet, urgent, certain. She sent word to Tunkey through the network that existed between the estates, the invisible architecture of communication that the plantation never fully mapped, the system of glances and signals and trusted messengers that enslaved people had built precisely for moments like this. The message was simple. It had to be. There was no time for anything elaborate, and elaborate plans leave traces that careful men can follow. She told him what was coming. She told him when. She told him where to meet her. The caverns beneath the great cliffs at the edge of St. Elizabeth, a place both of them knew by reputation if not by foot. A place the plantation men did not go to easily, not in the dark, not on unfamiliar ground. A place that belonged, in some older and more fundamental way, to the island itself. Tunkey received the message. He held it for the space of 3 breaths. Then he sent back one word. Coming. The night of flight. Deep island night. The sound of movement through undergrowth. Breath. Effort. The sea growing louder as the land rises. She left before dawn. She took nothing that would be missed before morning, nothing that would trigger the alarm before she had put enough distance between herself and the great house to matter. She moved through the dark by instinct and by memory, by the feel of the land under her feet and the sound of the sea as a compass point. The island at night was alive in ways it never was in the day, loud with insects, fragrant with night-blooming things, full of a quiet agency that belonged to no plantation and no great house. She moved through it like someone reclaiming something. On the neighboring estate, Tunkey moved too. They did not know, in those separate dark hours, whether the other was moving. They could not know. There was only the plan, and the choice they had each made in the privacy of their own hearts, and the direction of the sea. They ran toward each other across the dark southern parish of St. Elizabeth, across the cane fields and the scrubland and the rising ground that led to the ridge, running toward the cliffs and toward each other the way water runs toward the sea, because it has no other direction. Because it has never had any other direction. She reached the caverns first. She pressed her back against the cool limestone and she listened to the island and she waited. And then she heard his footsteps on the rock. And then she saw him. There are moments in a life that the body remembers long after the mind has forgotten everything else. This was one of those moments. The two of them in the dark of the cavern at the base of the cliff, the sea audible below, the first gray beginning of dawn showing at the mouth of the cave. Alive. Together. For the first time without a boundary line between them. They held each other without speaking, and for a moment, for one breathless, stolen, radiant moment, everything that had been taken from them fell away, and there was only this. The chase. Distant shouts. The sound of men moving fast through undergrowth. Torches. Urgency. Richard Chadley discovered the flight at first light. He did not take it quietly. The word went out across the estate, and then beyond it, the alarm that such systems maintained for exactly this occasion, the machinery of recapture that the plantation had spent decades refining. Men were sent in multiple directions. Men on horseback. Men who knew the southern parishes and knew the cliffs. Chadley himself rode out. The trail was not impossible to follow. Mizzy had been careful, but she had been moving fast in the dark, and the pre-dawn ground held traces. The pursuers moved quickly, tracking toward the ridge, toward the sound of the sea. Inside the cavern, Mizzy and Tunkey heard them coming. Not in words, in the way the island communicates urgency. A shift in the bird calls. A particular quality of silence that replaces one kind of sound before another arrives. The body knows these things before the mind names them. They looked at each other. Tunkey took her hand. She held it. They climbed. 1,700 feet. Wind. The sound of the sea far, far below. Running footsteps on limestone. Then the wind alone. The path up the cliff face was steep, and the limestone was rough beneath their hands and feet, and the wind from the Caribbean came up the gorge and hit them like a wall as they climbed. Behind them, the sound of pursuit was growing. Ahead of them, the sky was lightning pink and gold appearing at the eastern edge of the island, indifferent and beautiful. They reached the top. 1,700 feet above the Caribbean Sea. The cliff edge was pale limestone worn smooth by centuries of wind. Below, far, far below, the sea moved in its ancient patterns, catching the first light of morning, silver and deep and endless. The horizon was not a line from up there. It was, as it had always been, a feeling. They stood at the edge of the world that had been made for them, not the plantation world, not the estate world, not the world of ledgers and ownership and the deliberate crushing of human dignity, but this world. The old world. Wind and rock and sea and sky and the first morning light of a new day pressing itself over the island like a promise no man had made and no man could break. Below them, from the path up the ridge, they could hear the sounds of Chadley's men. Closing. Fast. Mizzy looked at Tunkey. Tunkey looked at Mizzy. There was no fear in what passed between them at that moment. The people who tell this story, and it has been told for 200 years, passed from mouth to ear across every generation, always say this part the same way. There was no fear. There was something else entirely. Something that had no name in the language of the plantation. Something the island understood even if the men climbing the ridge did not. It was the look of two people who have already decided. Who decided the moment they first held each other in the dark of the cavern. who had been deciding, perhaps, since the first evening at the silk cotton trees, not to die, but to refuse. To refuse the terms. To refuse the world that said their love was not theirs to have, that their bodies were not theirs to keep, that their future was a thing to be arranged and altered and erased by a man on a hill in a great house who had never once asked their names with any genuine desire to know the answer. They would not go back. They would not be separated. Tunkey tightened his hand around Mizzy's. She tightened hers around his. And together, hand in hand. At the edge of the island they had been borne onto and never been free upon. They leapt. The golden net. Wind falling away. A vast oceanic silence. Then, something impossible. Something ancient. Something kind. What happened next is not written in any ledger. It is not recorded in the documents of the Yardley Chase estate, which are silent on this matter, as the records of such places are always silent on the things that most deserve to be spoken. It is held in the oral tradition of the people of St. Elizabeth, in the telling of it passed down through generations, one mouth to one ear to one memory to one tongue, the way the truest things are always carried. An old woman, her name has not survived, but the story of what she saw was at the cliff's base that morning. She had come, as she sometimes did, to gather from the shore. She heard the wind change above her. She looked up. She saw them fall. And then she saw something that she spent the rest of her life describing, quietly, to people who had earned the right to hear it. As Mizzy and Tunkey fell toward the sea, as the 1,700 feet of air opened beneath them, the earth answered. Not with stone, not with water, not with any of the hard things the world had always offered them. With gold. A net of golden light, woven from something older than the plantation, and older than the island's colonial name, and older than any system that men had ever built to decide what other men were worth. A net that rose from the earth as though it had been waiting beneath the limestone all along, patient and certain, for exactly this moment. The net caught them. The old woman stood at the base of the cliff in the early morning light, and she watched, and what she saw she could only describe in the language of miracle, which is the language of things that are true but cannot be explained. She watched as the two of them, caught in that golden net, did not fall further. They rose. They rose with the morning light, carried upward, away from the cliff and away from the island and away from the world that had been made for them, into a sky that was turning gold and rose and the particular blue of a Caribbean morning that is not like the blue of any other sky on earth. And then they were gone. The old woman lowered herself to the rock, and she sat there for a long time. She did not tell the story until she was ready. And when she was ready, she told it slowly and completely, the way it deserved to be told. She said they had gone to the moon. She said they were there now, the two of them, living on the moon that lights the Jamaican night. She said that on clear nights, if you stood at the cliff's edge and looked up, you could feel them watching. Not with grief. Not with the weight of everything that had been done to them, and to all the people like them on all the plantations across all the islands. But with something else. With peace. With love. With the particular satisfaction of two people who chose their own ending, who refused to let the world write the last line, and who won. The cliff that remains. Present day. Wind on the cliff. Tourist voices distant. The sea unchanged below. A lighthouse in the distance. Richard Chadley's men reached the top of the cliff and found nothing but the wind and the edge and the sea below and the morning sky and the absence, the vast, unreachable, permanent absence of two people who had decided they were done being contained. The plantation is gone now. The great house of Yardley Chase has not survived into the century in any form worth naming. The cane fields are gone. The ledgers that once listed human beings alongside livestock and machinery are held in archives where scholars read them with the careful grief that such documents require. But the cliff remains, 1,700 feet above the Caribbean Sea. The limestone still pale and wind-smoothed. The horizon still that feeling, not a line. A lighthouse stands nearby now, built in the 19th century to guide ships along the southern coast. The same coast those ships once traveled carrying human cargo, which is an irony the island holds without flinching. Because it has learned to hold irony the way it holds everything deeply, without pretending it doesn't hurt, and without letting it have the final word. People come from all over the world to stand at Lover's Leap. They come for the view, which is genuinely extraordinary. They come for the drama of the height, the postcard perfection of the blue sea against the green hills. They take photographs. They stand at the edge and feel the gorge wind come up from below and move through their hair. And some of them, the ones who have heard the story, the ones who came not just for the view, but for the meaning, some of them stand there a little longer than the others. They stand there and they look out at the sea and they think about Mizzy. About the way she moved through a world determined to diminish her and remained, somehow, entirely herself. About her grandmother's stories kept safe in her memory. About the low private laugh she saved for moments of safety. They think about Tunkey. About the steadiness that cannot be manufactured. About the single word he sent back, coming. About a man who, in a world built to break him, found a way to keep his word. They think about what it costs to love someone when the world has made love dangerous. What it requires. What it means to say to another person in the face of everything arranged against you, you are worth this. You are worth all of this. And then they feel, if the evening is clear and the moon is up, they feel something watching. Not ominously, not with grief, with peace, with love, with the warm, quiet radiance of two people who chose their own story and who have been watching over everyone who comes to the edge ever since, making sure, from the moon, that no one who stands at Lover's Leap and looks out at the sea is entirely alone. For the ones who come to the edge. Night, the cliff, the sea, the moon rising over the Caribbean. A single clear note, perhaps a bird, perhaps something else entirely. This is why the place is called what it is called. Not because of loss, though there was loss. Not because of tragedy, though there was tragedy. But because of what Mizzy and Tunkey chose, at the very edge of everything, when every other choice had been taken from them. They chose each other. In every era, in every part of the world where people have been forced to love in the margins and the dark, in every time and place where the powerful have tried to legislate who deserves love and who does not, who may keep what they feel and who must surrender it. The story of the cliff at St. Elizabeth says the same thing. They chose each other. And the earth caught them. And the moon remembers. Remember their names. Mizzy. Tunkey. End of Lover's Leap. The Legend of Mizzy and Tunkey. End of